welcome back to another edition of the 8-Figure Attorney Podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, a good friend and colleague, Michael Bixon. Michael, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, great. It's great to be here, Seth. I appreciate it.
It's been a while since we've connected.
It's been a minute.
It has been a minute. We go way back to about 2010-ish.
Yeah, 2010, 2012, I think.
Yeah.
Which is crazy to think that it's been that long, but terrifying and shocking it has.
Yeah. Well, you know, back then you were, I don't know if you were just getting your criminal practice started, but you were really building your criminal law practice.
Yeah, that was towards the beginning. So I started practicing in 2010. And then, so I think it was around 2012 or so we might have met. And it was still, you know, the momentum was still going at that time, and it was still growing today. But obviously it's a very different practice than what it was, 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, today I want to talk about some topics that are in the news, some of which are kind of controversial, actually very controversial. But first, just if you could give us just a quick summary of your practice, the kind of cases you handle, your expertise.
Sure. So I practice exclusively criminal defense. That's all I do. Everything from misdemeanors to very serious felonies. I'd say the majority of my practice are more serious felony cases. Almost from the inception of my law firm, that's all I've really ever done. Mm-hmm. So, you name it, we've handled it. We do a lot of drug cases too, a lot of trafficking cases, handled them into the thousands of pounds, but almost every serious felony we've handled.
Gotcha. So, we're going to come back to your practice and some of the cases that you've handled over the years, and also the work you're doing on Court TV. But right now, in the news, there's a guy by the name of Andrew Tate, and I don't know much about him, but from what little I know, he is an incredibly controversial figure, mm-hmm. With views that, frankly, I don't agree with. But have you heard about what's going on with Andrew Tate in Romania? What do you know about that?
I have. I mean, I was aware of him as sort of this online, over-the-top figure before he got arrested, and I think I actually was recently becoming more, I guess he was more in the news right before he got arrested. You just saw his stuff everywhere, mm-hmm. and obviously very controversial. A lot of his opinions would definitely be, I guess, the least you could say is they're challenging in today's society, right? Very misogynistic approach towards women, this very sort of ultra-aggressive, domineering sort of take on how men should exist in the world today. And then this whole thing led up to his recent arrest in Romania, where now he's being charged with a number of very serious charges that could lead to quite a lengthy stay in a Romanian cell.
Mm-hmm. And I guess one of those charges is human trafficking.
Correct, yeah. There's human trafficking, I think rape, there's like organized crime. And it's typical, like these are just what we know about right now. And it's very typical for these charges to change, to be amended up to the point of like somebody being tried. So we just know the very basics, and whether or not they're going to tack on additional charges, or whether there's other stuff that we don't know about that they might put in there later, that's also a possibility.
And is it your understanding that he's charged with these crimes in Romania?
Correct, yeah. So this entire case, the charges where he's being held, all of it's going on in Romania.
Mm. And I guess Romanian law and U.S. law are very different.
Oh, totally different. I mean,
you are not an expert in Romanian law.
No, I'm not.
But like, what can you share with us about? Sort of give us some insight on what you think is happening there, and what you know about Romanian law from what you've read, and just kind of give your thoughts on that.
Some of the stuff that has stood out to me, and the biggest difference between Romanian law and law here in the United States that I've seen so far. Romania does not have jury trials, and that's probably one of the cornerstones of American law, right? The ability to be tried by your peers. But in Romania, it's just you either have a single judge or a panel of judges who are both a finder of fact and law in your case. Here in the U.S., you can do that if you choose. You can have a judge just be the trier of both fact and law. That's called a bench trial. Or you can have a jury trial where the jury, members of your community, would basically be the finders of fact, and the judge would be the finder of law. But in Romania, it's just all of it's a bench trial with either one or a number of judges on a panel who would try your case.
I'm curious, how do you think that could or might help or hurt Tate's chances of getting off?
Considering the nature of his charges and the nature of his online personality, I don't think that his online content and his reputation, those things are going to help him at all, because they do fit into the nature of these charges that he has, right? if I was a defense attorney, I know that I would have a very uphill battle convincing a jury that he's not who he puts himself out there on social media as, or that there is no relationship between that and his charges. When you're dealing with the judge, though, to me, you're dealing with somebody a little bit more objective, somebody who, this is their job to review the facts and law in a case. Mm-hmm. So if I was a defense attorney, I would certainly, at the bare minimum, hope that somebody who their profession is to be objective about both the facts and law wouldn't be as influenced by his online personality.
Do you think that his online content, I'm curious, like if this were in the United States, would his online content be evidence that could and likely would get in front of a jury?
It possibly could. There's two ways. One, if you're going to do something like character evidence, which I'm sure you know is very hard to get in, and it's usually only under sort of these exceptional circumstances, but there are circumstances where it could come in. Otherwise, if there is something that he's talking about and it either directly related to the crime, they could certainly use as evidence, or if it was in line with the charges, they could use as well. So there are a number of opportunities for prosecutors out there, at least if it were here in America, to be able to use some of the things that he said and some of his views against him in a court of law.
And just to go back, do you think there's a scenario, or maybe the question is, how could having a trial in front of a judge, a bench trial, be sort of disadvantageous to him?
Just like if you were to argue a case in front of a jury, and while I think you would have an uphill battle as a defense attorney because of all the stuff that he's published out there and his online reputation, on the flip side, you can play to a jury's emotions, and I think you're going to have a harder time with a judge. What we know so far are that there are these allegations, right, that he's done all these things, rape and sex trafficking, organized crime. What we don't know is whether or not there's any outside evidence. So to me, when you have any type of serious, sex crime case like this, and it's just based upon testimony, usually it's a much harder case for the prosecution to go forward on, right? What we don't know is whether or not there's any of this outside evidence, recordings, business records that might show he was in organized crime and so forth. The reason why I bring all this up is if you're a judge, and I think that this case is based upon just testimony, that actually might put him in a very advantageous position. If there are things that outside evidence, things like recordings, business records, DNA, those things I think are going to be incredibly hurtful to his case in front of a judge. So it just depends on sort of what kind of evidence they have they're going to be presenting to the judge. If it's just testimony, I think he's going to be more favorable because it's just a judge. If there's outside evidence, I think that it's going to be weighing very heavily against him.
I understand. When you say outside evidence, you kind of alluded to some of what that might consist of. Can you give maybe some more examples?
Sure. So it's natural that, and I'm really focusing on the rape aspect of the case, that oftentimes you might just have just testimony. X did this to Y, right? And that happens a lot. But if there is outside evidence, things like a DNA test, for example, hospital records, if there's any type of surveillance, if there was video, if there were pictures, anything like that really weighs heavily in a sex crime case where oftentimes, like I said before, it's just based upon the allegations. And you could be convicted on them, make no mistake. Like, you don't need outside evidence, at least in the US, to be convicted on a charge like that. You could just I could just tell a jury, he did this, and if they believe me, that's it, you could be convicted.
Now, the burden of proof. Explain what the burden of proof would be here in the United States. A lot of people know what it is, but kind of explain that, and in lawyer terms and legal terms, but then break it down just for everyone. And then, to the extent that you're familiar with the burden of proof in Romania or what you've heard, kind of talk about that a little bit.
So here in the U.S., I'm sure you've heard beyond a reasonable doubt, right? I mean, it's a saying that almost everyone knows, no matter how old you are, beyond a reasonable doubt. It is the highest legal standard. If you are going to arrest someone, there's a standard of evidence that they need in order to arrest you. If you're going to sue someone and win, there's a certain level of evidence that you need in order to win. But if they are going to convict you of a crime, if they're going to take away your liberty, they need to meet the highest standard of evidence, right, beyond a reasonable doubt. Not to say that you can't have a doubt, but it has to be a reasonable doubt, okay? That's here in the U.S., and the burden is on the prosecution, the state, to prove that case against you. As a defendant, you don't have to do anything. You could sit there in the entire case and say nothing at all, and if a jury doesn't think the state has met their burden, congratulations, you walk. Romania has a similar system where the burden is still on the state to present their case against him. That's good. The majority of countries in the world have that kind of burden. I think like Mexico has it essentially where the burden is on the defendant to prove their innocence. But most countries around that world have a standard like that where it's on the defendant.
Understood.
I'm sorry, where it's on the state, not the defendant.
Understood. Now, you mentioned the charges are human trafficking, rape, and possibly organized crime.
Correct.
Have you had a chance to work in this, like defend somebody who's been charged with human trafficking?
I have, actually.
Talk to us, just educate us a little bit about what that's like here in the United States and what the state has to prove and how one may go about defending somebody who's been charged with human trafficking.
I think that there's a big misconception about what human trafficking actually is. I certainly did until I saw my first case like that, right? Human trafficking is actually, oddly enough, despite what most people think, really essentially pimping with an added element of coercion, right? So as an example, if there were somebody out there who was acting in the role of like a pimp, for instance, right? And they took away someone who was working the role of a prostitute, they took away their passport. I am now exerting an element of control over you. I am now human trafficking you. That's the only additional element needed is coercion, right? It could be physical. It doesn't have to be, though. Like, for instance, if I took your passport, that's one of the things that he's accused of doing, are taking these women's passports from them and essentially making them work in these sort of sex industry acts, right? But generally, wherever you go, that's a needed element of coercion. And I think he fit into the common one, which is taking like a driver's license or passport.
How would you anticipate that a defense attorney might try to or might defend him against that charge or those charges?
So to me, that depends on what the evidence is. I mean, obviously right now we know there's testimony, there's allegations from some of the alleged victims. That would be the first part, is how reliable is that testimony? Who is this testimony coming from? And you have to look into all of that. Outside of that, what we don't know, like I was mentioning earlier, is whether or not there's any outside evidence, right? Are there business records from like the organized crime charge? Is there any DNA or anything like that? And each one of those has a line of defenses around it, right, that you can attack. But it really comes down to the nature of the evidence and how you're attacking it. So what we do know, for instance, right now, is that there's that bare minimum testimony, right? Somebody said he did something, him and his brother. To me, I think the most important thing is how credible that testimony is, and I'm sure that's what his attorneys are going to be going after first.
I understand. Now, he is in Romania. I believe he's in detention in Romania. I think there was a hearing today.
Correct.
On, I guess, maybe an appeal of that detention.
I saw that, yeah. Essentially, like here in the U.S., you can try to get a bond or bail to be able to wait your case while out of custody while it progresses, because it can take quite some time. I mean, cases can go on for years. Sometimes they're quicker, but it's more common that they go on for quite a while. And so the question becomes, are you going to wait in jail while your case progresses? No one wants to wait in jail, and so it's typical to file a motion for bond or bail or something like that. And it's essentially what his attorneys are doing. On the flip side of it, you have prosecutors who are usually arguing against it because usually you're either a flight risk or you're a danger to the community or something to that effect.
Understood. I guess he's a U.S. citizen. I think he has a dual citizenship in the United States and Britain.
Correct, yeah.
And I understand that he has multiple passports. Like, what are the chances, I'm just curious, what are the chances that he might be charged in another country? And what would that look like to get him moved or extradited to that country? So
based out of what's happened in Romania, unless some of the crimes that he's charged with in Romania happened in another country, he's not going to be charged there. Even if, like, for instance, one of the alleged victims has dual citizenship, like let's say for the U.S. and Romania, for instance, it wouldn't change. Like, he couldn't be prosecuted here in the U.S. He would have had to have committed a crime in the U.S., the actual crime. Venue or where you're going to be charged is typically based in a criminal court based upon where the incident happened, not just where a defendant lives.
Well, what if the let's just say that these women were held against their will in Romania, but they were U.S. citizens, and he was coercing them to come, say online. Do you envision any scenario where the United States can charge him with human trafficking?
Most likely no. it would be a stretch. I mean, you don't get me wrong. You can always overcharge someone, and I've seen some ridiculous charges. But the chance of him being charged in the U.S. for what happened in Romania would be slim. Now, whether or not his business that I'm sure is part of this alleged organized crime, whether or not it reached out into the U.S. and they can make some allegations that he actually did commit a crime here because of what he did there, that would be different. But everything that I've seen so far, it looks like everything will be prosecuted solely in Romania.
God, is there anything else that kind of stands out to you about this case that you find pretty interesting from the standpoint of a criminal defense lawyer?
To me, I think it's just the challenge of working with a defendant who is so well known in a community. And sometimes that reputation can hurt, sometimes it can help. For Andrew Tate, I definitely think that his reputation is going to hurt him. And he's so unique in that the charges that he has align so well with this image that he portrays. Whether or not it's actually him or not doesn't matter, right? When you put it out there to millions and billions of people over the world of this is who you are and this is your message, and then you get charged with a criminal act that sort of falls in line almost with who you're portraying to be, that can be a real challenge to overcome. But I personally enjoy challenges, and I think they're interesting and fun. And so I think it would certainly be an interesting challenge to figure out a way to overcome the adversity of that online reputation that I think is actually going to be hurtful in this case.
Yeah. I'm curious, as you're talking, it's occurring to me that as a criminal defense attorney, you may not always agree on a personal level or align on a personal level with your client. I'm curious, how do you as a criminal defense attorney, go in and zealously advocate for a client with whom you may completely disagree on their personal views? Say, for example, somebody like Andrew Tate.
To me, you obviously represent the individual, right? And there isn't a case where you do anything less than 100% in your best. Mm-hmm. To do so, I think, obviously, would be negligence on our part. But more importantly, when I defend someone, it's who I'm defending them against, and it's the government. For me personally, I always enjoy being on the side of the little guy against the big guy. And when you're prosecuting a case, that you're representing the government. You're not representing any actual victim, right? Mm-hmm. The victim in the case is the actual government. As odd as that sounds, you're not representing the actual victim in a crime. To represent the victim in a crime, they'd be suing my client, but he wouldn't be charged with anything. To me, I can easily represent anyone because I know at the end of the day who's on the other side of that table, which is the government. And the government coming after citizens, I think, is something that we all have to be extremely, not just careful about, but diligent in making sure that our rights are being represented. So whatever the individual's personality is, whoever they are as a person, to me doesn't matter. I've represented plenty of people who I've disagreed with on fundamental levels, but at the end of the day, I'm still able to effectively represent them because, again, I know who's on the other side of that table.
Gotcha. And so just explain that in lay terms. So even though allegedly there were victims here, they're actually not on the other side of the case. They're essentially witnesses. They're victims.
That's correct.
Right. Explain that distinction.
So criminal law is very interesting. Most people think that it's the victim who is being represented by the prosecutor, and it's not. The prosecutor is actually representing the state, because the injury in this case is that the state's laws have been violated. The criminal code has been violated, therefore the state has been injured. And the victim, as you mentioned earlier, is really just a witness to the injury of the state, that its criminal laws were violated, right? And it's a bit twisted, obviously. For a prosecutor, they have to obviously walk a very fine line of letting victims know that we don't actually represent you. You are the victim. We represent the state. Sometimes you'll see that line being blurred quite a bit, obviously, because the prosecutor has to work with a victim, much more so than a defense attorney usually will. But a prosecutor does not represent that victim. They only represent the state, because it's the state who has technically, legally been injured, not the victim, as odd as that sounds.
So then what remedy, if any, is there that might be available to the actual victim beyond sort of the satisfaction of knowing that they have been charged, that in this case, Andrew Tate or somebody else has actually been charged or has been convicted of a crime for which they were a victim? But what actual remedy is there, or might be available to the victims of these alleged crimes?
So if you have been a victim of a crime, you essentially have two paths to a remedy, right? On one side, obviously, you have the criminal courts, where the defendant can be punished. They can have probation, jail, prison, whatever, right? On the other side of it, if you are the victim of a crime, you can actually sue the defendant, right? So, for instance, if you were to punch me, right, I could have you arrested for simple battery and misdemeanor, and then I could also sue you for simple battery. The two aren't mutually exclusive. You can both have someone prosecuted in a criminal court and sue them for the same exact thing. It's not double jeopardy. They're two different cases.
Gotcha. So, well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you educating me and our viewers about this this situation, because it's incredibly controversial, but it's in the news front and center, and I was curious to get your take on that, because I'm trying to grasp who he is, what he's been accused of, and what might come out of it. So I appreciate that.
It's going to be an interesting case to watch for sure.
So your practice. Tell me a little bit more about your practice, and sort of what would you, if you were to sort of break down by percentage the types of cases you handle. I know you mentioned felony, but can you kind of break that down a little bit more specific?
I mean, my practice, if you were to look at it as a pie chart, right, it'd be 100% criminal defense. Within that pie chart, though, I'd probably say 70% of that at least would be serious felonies, and I'd probably split those felonies usually into like one of two categories. On one side, you have drug and alcohol offenses, and the other, you have some type of injury to a person. That could be aggravated assault, it could be murder, and the list goes on, but some type of serious injury case, right? But I would say those are the two big blocks of felony cases that I do. Okay. When it comes to misdemeanor, you have just about everything in there.
I got you. Okay. And so the injury cases, are they, can you get into that a little bit further, since I'm a personal injury lawyer, workers' comp lawyer, but tell me in the criminal context what that looks like.
So the big difference between what you might see and what I might see is you might see someone get hit by a car, right?
Okay.
And then somebody files a lawsuit and they get some money at the end of it. In my kind of case, somebody might get hit by a car, but it's because somebody intended to hit them with a car.
I see.
Your case, there's just negligence, right? Like an accident happened, somebody had a duty, they breached that duty, someone was hurt, and somebody gets sued. In my case, somebody intentionally, allegedly, right, hit somebody with a car. And that would be the closest analogy and sort of example that I could see. It pops to mind. It's that there's a level of intent in my cases that my client is accused of doing. I'm obviously defending my client. It's a very different world from civil law. We have our own procedures, we have our own rules. The criminal code section is completely different from the civil section. So there is a really big gap between the two, and that, for me, is why it's so important to specialize in what I do, just like you do. That those rules in and out, how the courts work in and out, and you can properly represent someone the way that they need to be.
Sure. In the cases that we're handling here at our law firm, the vast majority do end up in a settlement, and that's obviously after, in most cases, months of litigation, trial preparation, and often just on the steps of the courthouse, literally or figuratively. But in your cases, like when I say I mean the criminal defense world and the criminal space. How often are cases getting resolved with a settlement or with a compromise?
A lot do. I'd say the vast majority, you'll end up with either the case being dismissed or some type of plea offer, right? For us, I'd probably say, it's the vast majority of cases, even up to the day of a trial, you could enter a plea or some other type of pre-trial result could happen. I've had cases that ended up being a plea halfway through a trial, So it does happen a lot. I'd say very few cases make it to a trial. Usually the ones that do are either where the penalty is so high that the plea deal also involves such a large amount of time, there's no reason why you shouldn't go to a trial. You don't really have much to lose.
I see.
There's other cases where people are just adamant that they didn't do it, and they want the state to prove their case against them, and I completely respect that. I'm happy to do it, right? I think the biggest impediment to a lot of people going to trial is just the fact that you see what's at the end of it if you lose, right? That you could be going into custody, into a jail or a prison. And that's really hard for a lot of people to accept as a risk, right? I think it's one of the best plays for the government, for the prosecution in a case is that they know at the end of the day, they get to go home, and so does their client if they lose. But for my client, they know that, yeah, there's the possibility that I could do some time if I lose. And that's just, for some people, it's too daunting a prospect, no matter how innocent or how guilty they are, which is obviously a big problem.
I'm curious, how much does a defendant's financial position really impact their ability to get justice and to be defended properly in a U.S. court?
It's hard to say. In the U.S., despite what people think, you don't automatically get a public defender, right? You have to apply for a public defender. And if you qualify for a public defender based upon how little you make, and they have guidelines that you have to meet, they're insanely low. I mean, you essentially have to be in poverty to be able to qualify for a public defender. But if you don't, then you're stuck with the prospect of trying to hire an attorney. And attorneys aren't cheap, right? It takes a lot of education. It takes a lot of practice and investment on an attorney to become good at what they do. And so naturally, it's not cheap to afford an attorney. And so for people who don't qualify for a public defender, it can be very, very difficult trying to go out and actually hire an attorney. I do my best to make myself accessible to the public because I truly believe in what I do. But at the same time, it is very hard for people to come up with that kind of money to be able to afford a good attorney.
I'm curious, where does that passion come from?
I think earlier I sort of touched on it, of, the little guy against the big guy. For me, I have always really respected that environment of criminal defense, right? That you every day get to walk in there and stand up to the government and say, prove your case, not just roll over, not just take away our rights. To me, that's a real passion, and I truly enjoy that. Have you discovered your why? Have you figured out, what has moved you in that direction? I think it's just saying no to the man.
Saying no to the man.
That's what it comes down to.
I got you. Now, you've been on Court TV. How long have you been, how often and for how long have you been going on TV?
Court TV, I think, came back on the air maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And when they did, it was here in Atlanta. And they asked me to come on when they were first just sort of getting set up again. And so I went on, and I had never really done TV up to that point. I had done podcasts, I had done some radio and things like that, but I'd never been on TV, and it was terrifying. I had no idea. I thought I had completely messed everything up. And shockingly, I guess they liked me, and so they had me back on over and over and over, and now I'm one of their guest analysts on there. I used to do it probably up till last year a lot more. At some point I was going on 2-3 times a week. This year a lot less. I think I've just been, obviously, now that the pandemic is coming more to a close, courts reopening, I've been pretty busy with court.
Gotcha. Now, when you go on Court TV, are you always talking about criminal matters, or do they kind of delve into some other areas
Mostly
of law?
Criminal. I mean, there have been some other areas, employment, civil, things like that. But for the most part, it's criminal law.
What for other lawyers out there that may want to get on TV, what advice do you have for them and to get on, and what advice do you have once they're on so that they can succeed?
I think establishing some type of online presence where, for a news outlet to call you, they want to see who you are, how you look, how you present yourself to the public. And when you have some type of online presence, it makes it a lot easier for them to make that decision. Fortunately, I already had one online. We're on Instagram and YouTube and everything else, and so they saw that we had done some videos. They saw that they liked the way that we presented ourselves out there, and I think that was one of the things that made them give us a call.
Gotcha. Do you spend time creating content on a regular basis for your online
I do.
brand?
In those few hours of free time throughout the day, I try to put something out there. I probably could do a much better job at our Instagram and other online media, but I do make an effort at it.
Do you have a social media team, or are you doing it yourself?
No, just me.
And what advice do you have for those lawyers and frankly business owners or just individuals that want to build a personal brand? How do you go about creating content, and what sort of is the motivation for the type of content you're putting out there?
The ultimate motivation should be the end goal, right? Of at some point seeing more people walk in the door to buy your good or service. The hardest thing I think for a lot of people is one that when you start doing these online social media stuff, it's very daunting, right? You don't know where to begin, you don't know how to get followers, you don't know how to get likes. And the most important thing, I think, is just to start creating content. And for a lot of people, it's really hard, right? I mean, I never really like done a lot of stuff with me in front of a camera. And when I did it, I was like, this is terrible. And objectively, some of it is in the beginning, right? But that's how you get better, is you do it more and more and more. And the more you do it, you know, without even being an online social media guru, you will get more likes and more followers, and it will grow. But you just have to continue to put stuff out there and put yourself out there. And I think that's the hard part.
And I agree 100%. What type of, like, how would you describe the content you're putting out there?
I try to do more informative stuff. I try to educate people on the law, share some of the things that I've seen and some of the things that I've learned. I think that a lot of the public have some misconceptions about how the laws work, and in worst case scenarios, they just don't know at all, right? And to be fair, it's confusing. I mean, the government expects that you know these laws. Ignorance is not an excuse to a crime, right?
Right.
But some of these laws are so convoluted and misleading, and that if you don't have someone sit down and explain it to you, the average person would have no idea how it works. And so I try my best to explain some of these laws to the general public.
What are some of the most common sort of laws that you're explaining, and can you break them down for us right here, right now?
Oh God, probably not.
No, okay.
I need books. I need my computer.
I gotcha.
But no, I mean, realistically, I think probably the hardest part is explaining how the courts work, like rules of evidence and things like that. You know, it's just, you could talk for days about just hearsay, which I know you're probably shuddering at the thought of it right now. But
yeah, I am. But no, give us just a few, like a few nuggets, criminal law that, you know, kind of break it down, something that might be complicated that people hear about, whether it's hearsay, whether it's...
I'll tell you this one, and this is probably one of the most important ones that I see, because I do so many of these cases when it comes to drug trafficking, right? Okay. People have a misconception about what drug... And don't get me wrong, this is state to state, it's all totally different, right? But in Georgia, it's not about, like, you don't have to be crossing the border, right? It doesn't matter, like, what you're doing with the drug. All that matters is how much of that drug you have. So people are sort of living with this misconception that, like, well, I need to do something with it. And the reality is you don't. Whatever that drug is, whether it's like cocaine or marijuana, it doesn't matter, right? What matters is how much of it you have. You can be charged with trafficking. And that's very important to realize, because the vast majority of drug crimes we have in Georgia don't include any type of, like, mandatory minimum. You don't need to go to prison for a mandatory amount of time. But with trafficking, you do, right? I mean, you could be going to prison for a mandatory minimum of 25 years if you have enough of a substance on you. And it's not as great as most people would think.
So give me like an example of that. Give me an example.
So I'll give you, like, 28 grams cocaine, right? You're going to prison for years. That's not a maximum, that's a guarantee. If you are convicted of trafficking of, well, any drug really, you're going to prison 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, up to, like, I think the mandatory minimum on the largest grade of trafficking, like cocaine, is like 25 years minimum. That's the same as rape in the state of Georgia, right? And think about how insane that is for a second, right? That you could be going to prison the same mandatory minimum as rape, as just possessing a drug, just possessing. But that's Georgia law.
And so you have clients that come to you with that type of case.
Sure.
And they're probably absolutely shocked that they're facing so much time.
Oh, 100%. I see people fly in. One of the most common ones is people flying in from California, and their suitcase is loaded with like 10 pounds of marijuana, right? Well, they bought it legally in California, but then they came here, and 10 pounds is trafficking. Now you're looking at prison time.
So how much time could you be looking at in that case?
It depends. They've been working with the laws on it. It's either 3 or 5 years is a mandatory minimum on trafficking marijuana. I always forget the two. But either way, it's a mandatory minimum. Like, you can't get around it unless you get the charge reduced or dismissed. And that's the key in a lot of trafficking cases. Bare minimum, get that charge reduced to something like possession with intent that doesn't carry that mandatory minimum. And then you can get outside of the mandatory prison time.
Gotcha. Michael, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, if they're looking for help, hopefully they don't need your help. But if they did need your help, how could they find you?
We're always available by phone. You can give us a call. We do free phone consults. The number is 404-551-5684. You can find us on Instagram at bixonlaw.com. We're on Facebook, YouTube, I think TikTok. Just about everything. So
I've got to ask, what are you doing on TikTok?
Same thing,
just content.
Much more condensed versions of us trying to either talk about a law or just informing the the people about changes to the law or news events that I think are particularly important with criminal defense.
When we met years, almost probably more than a decade ago, you had no idea that both of us were going to be on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook too.
If you had told me that such a thing existed, I would have thought you were crazy.
Yeah. Have you heard about ChatGPT?
I have actually.
I got to ask thoughts on that.
Let me tell you, I actually tried it recently, and I was curious if I asked it a legal question, and I still remember this, I asked whether or not hearsay is allowed at a preliminary hearing. And as a general rule, hearsay is not. However, there are some times in which case it is. I asked ChatGPT, and it gave a great breakdown of the law, but its ultimate analysis was wrong. But it was interesting to see it, and I was really surprised. I mean, if you had asked most law students, I think its answer would have been better. Even though it came to the wrong conclusion, the analysis was very good.
Have you had a chance to look at it and study it enough to kind of have an opinion about whether or not artificial intelligence is going to, and how it's going to impact the legal industry?
I grew up with Terminator 2. Okay, this is the end. No, just joking. I saw a case recently, and I don't know if it was just a mock trial, but they tried having an AI defend someone in a case, and it seemingly did all right. I think as technology gets better, I do think that it could be of great assistance in going through and researching the law, because the law is very rarely black and white, and so to go through and at least get an overall summarization of certain key aspects of it is challenging for a lot of attorneys. If you could have an AI do that to make your job at presenting that or analyzing it, that would be huge. I don't think that we're going to have things like AI defending people in a courtroom anytime soon. And if it is, it's in the far off future. I don't even know how legally that would work, right? But I do think that it could be of great help at some point.
Gotcha. Well, Michael, I appreciate you coming on. If you need any help with any criminal matters, Michael Bixon is here to help. And
thanks, Seth.
Thanks for coming on.
Appreciate it.